Council asked me to try to make another presentation today to talk a little bit about the endowment fund, because with the pending anticipated receipt of the Messinger bequest, it makes what's going to go on in the fall and then ultimately in calendar 2025 a much bigger deal than what the first couple passes through the current endowment fund policy has looked like. So we want to try to get people thinking about that a little ahead of the fall, because this is a extremely great opportunity for us to try to do some things differently as we move forward here at Prince of Peace. So the question a lot of folks have that aren't following the normal operation of some of these financial matters at Prince of Peace is, well, again, how does this endowment fund work? And we look a little bit like the guy on the right here scratching our head trying to figure that out, right? So Kim's in the saddle now, so maybe we can ask her to advance this slide, please. So the purpose of the fund is to maintain and grow the current financial assets of the congregation, to ensure the continued efficient operation of the organization, the maintenance and repair of our property holdings, and the execution of our ministry programs. The fund will provide a steady stream of revenue to help fund identified programs, as well as provide a source of emergency funding for extraordinary needs. So this isn't about the day-to-day operations of the church as much as it is about the longer-term vision of where we might be going and ensure that we can get there. Next, please. Sometimes the good way to understand what something is to talk about what it's not, right? It's not some things, that means it's other things. So the endowment fund currently does not supply fund for the week-to-week operation of the church, right? We rely on a general fund that is fueled primarily by offerings. That's our means of paying for those expected operating expenses. So endowment fund has nothing to do with the week-to-week operation of the church. The endowment fund is not related to our annual operating budget. You've heard a lot of talk over the years about our budget. This has nothing to do with that. Our expected operating expenses are planned for in our annual budget and are paid out of our general fund. Okay? The endowment fund is not related in any way to the Terzo fund. The Terzo fund is managed by Prince of Peace, but does not have any link to our regular operating expenses, our budget, or the endowment fund. It is independent of all other financial concerns here at POP. So endowment has nothing to do with any of that, right? Longer term vision is what it is that we're thinking about with the endowment fund. Next. So how does it work? The endowment fund essentially functions as a large account holding the primary endowment assets, primarily invested in mutual funds. From this pool of money, an annual disbursement of funds will be made to what we call sub-funds, which council recommends and the congregation reviews and approves. Up to 5 sub-funds can exist at any one time, and they will act as designated holding accounts. Money is held in those accounts until it is needed to pay for expenses related to a specific project or use. Currently, we have 5 sub-funds. Those sub-funds are what we call non-budgeted property expenses, and that is what we call a permanent sub-fund. The types of things that we're thinking about there are things like several years ago when the electric problem developed out here right at the edge of the road. There was no way to plan for that. There was no way to expect that we were going to have that issue. It's just one of those things that happens in life. And the bad news is when it happens, it must be fixed because we can't operate without electricity. But it also results in a large bill, like $17,000. And when you're not planning for that, well, where's that money coming from? So we've created a structure here, recognizing that we're always going to have across time these so-called non-budgeted property expenses, and we need to have some kind of mechanism in place that's going to allow us to plan for them and manage them when they occur. So that's a permanent sub-fund. It's not going to go away. We're going to continue to fuel money into it so that as these things come up, we're all set to go and can handle them, at a moment's notice. Unlike non-budgeted property expenses, we have 4 other sub-funds that are listed up there. And those are more specific in the sense that they're there for a particular reason, and at some point in time that reason may be resolved and we don't need them anymore, and we may close those sub-funds and move on to something else. Examples are number 2, office technology. Currently, this holds money for the replacement of our office printer or copier. We identified about 2 years ago the likely coming end of the lifespan of that particular piece of equipment. It's expensive. It's like a $5,000 or $6,000 cost to replace it. And so again, rather than be caught short one day when we suddenly have that unit fail and we're no longer able to repair it or work with it, we've already planned ahead and have money set aside so that when we need to replace that unit, we can do it in a moment in time, and the money's there and set up and ready to go. That's the purpose of that. And when that happens, we may close that sub-fund and move on to something else that we have to plan for. Number 3, outdoor enhancements. 2 years ago at our annual meeting, a year and a half ago now, we approved a sub-fund with a limited amount of funds for work around the outside property and so forth. To date, there's been no use of that money, but the money is set aside for that purpose. Number 4, Mr. Fix-It. Last year at November, we approved a sub-fund called Mr. Fix-It, which was visioning an effort to try to match people that had needs for a particular project or task, along with service providers who might be willing to do those tasks. There's been some other hurdles that we've encountered with that particular sub-fund, and it looks like that sub-fund is not going to be functional for us to use because of some insurance liability concerns behind the scenes. So it's likely that one is going to be closed, and the limited several $100s that were dedicated to that redirected to another purpose. And then finally, the wider church. The wider church actually is a sub-fund that has $0 in it right now, because what we approved was endowment monies being used to cover expenses related to individuals participating in broader church work, like attending the Northeastern Pennsylvania Synod Assembly, where we have transportation costs, registration costs, hotel costs, that type of thing. And you may recall that in recent weeks, that assembly has already happened in 2024, and we've utilized the several $100s that were placed in that sub-fund to offset those costs. So we've already seen the benefit of that particular sub-fund by utilizing the money that was placed there to offset those costs. It's likely that we'll renew that and go forward, but that's up to the council and this group, not just present today, but those of you and others who will be here at the November congregational meeting to make decisions about that. Yes?
Before you get, I ask, when you go to the meetings in Chicago, does the Synod pick up your expenses?
The question for everybody else was, Karen was asking whether or not when I was on the ELCA Church Council and had attend meetings in Chicago, whether the church picked up that expense. The answer is yes, the church did pick up that expense, but the church we're referencing would be the wider church, the ELCA, not Prince of Peace. Okay? They would actually pay my airfare there, my hotel costs, and other meal expenses there. Although that some portion of that required turning in receipts and being reimbursed, which I just waived. I didn't try to reclaim that. But yes, the church did cover those expenses. So these are the current 5 sub-funds that we have set up. Next slide, please. So how does all of that work? How does the money get into those sub-funds? So we start out, just reading through this quickly, sub-funds are invested in a variety of financial instruments based on the amount of time that we expect the money to be held before being used to pay for an expense. So for example, this property permanent sub-fund, we have invested in mutual funds because we expect some amount of that money to be there a long time. And the best benefit for us with the greatest amount of safety, married together with some long-term growth potential, is mutual funds. But when we go to other smaller amounts, like the several $100s that we had set aside for the wider church sub-fund, it's not feasible to have that in the marketplace because, unfortunately, you can't get into a mutual fund in many cases with $300 or $400. You have to have a greater sum of money. So that was sitting in a bank account until it was utilized to disperse. So there'll be a variety of instruments that we're using to hold or invest these monies, and it'll be dependent on what we think the timeline is and the use and access to the money that will be required. Second bullet point, sub-fund monies are only used for expenses specific to that sub-fund. The monies cannot be used for anything else. Council may elect to close a sub-fund, in which case the money in the sub-fund will revert back to the overall endowment fund. That last statement is kind of like what you're going to probably see with Mr. Fix-It. We're probably going to close that sub-fund. Council probably will make that decision in the fall, and the several $100s that are there will just go back into the overall endowment fund and be available for possible future disbursement on something else. Sub-fund ideas can be proposed by congregational members or council. So if any of you have a great idea of what you think Prince of Peace ought to consider doing, you could propose it as a potential sub-fund, right? And if we don't receive those types of proposals from congregational members, then council themselves are thinking and visioning about what it is that they think these things might be that we need to do in the future, and can come to the congregation in a November annual meeting with those proposals. So it can come from any source. Council will vet, in other words, kind of proof all sub-fund proposals and bring individual motions for the creation of sub-funds and the disbursement of money to sub-funds at our November congregational meeting. So November is the action point to get all of these things approved and done. And finally, new sub-funds can only be created if approved by a majority of voting members at our congregational meeting. If a sub-fund motion is defeated, in other words, not approved, any monies that were proposed to be dispersed to that sub-fund will instead be directed to the non-budgeted property expense sub-fund. So if we say, hey, Jim Jennings has a great idea, we should do X, you all vote on it and say, no, 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 that's not a great idea, we shouldn't do that. Whatever amount of money was going to go to Jim Jennings' proposed sub-fund, instead it's going to go over to the non-budgeted property piece by default. That's the guideline we have in place. So if we take it one slide further, that goes to this point, so play along with me for a moment. It is important to understand that the congregation must approve the creation of all sub-funds. However, the congregation is not approving whether or not money will be dispersed from the endowment fund. Our governing policy states that money will be dispersed annually, but the congregation decides where it will be directed. The congregation does this by voting yes to motions that council brings concerning new sub-fund creation, or motions directing disbursement to existing sub-funds, or by voting no on motions council brings which will result in the defeated suggested disbursement defaulting to the non-budgeted property expense fund. Wow, that's a lot of words. What the heck does all that mean? So let's use a crazy example that's never going to happen, but hopefully helps make the point. Let's say John Martacci brings forward a motion that says he thinks it would be a great idea to allocate $1,000 worth of money into a new sub-fund that's called Christian Cruises, with the notion being that we're going to form a committee to explore the viability of establishing a cruise line for people that want to cruise the Caribbean and are Christians. All right? Well, that comes before you folks, and you all say, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. That's a no. We're not going to approve that. What you've done by voting no is you said, we're not going to fund the Christian cruise line, But what we are going to do still is take the $1,000 that John thought we should disperse to that, and we're going to put it instead in the non-budgeted property expense fund. We didn't stop the $1,000 from being dispersed. We just directed it someplace else. So your yes vote would say it's going to go to John's proposal. Your no vote says, no, don't put it there, put it over in the non-budgeted property expense. But an option is not that we're not going to disperse $1,000. We're still going to disperse the $1,000. You're just directing where it's going to go. Is that clear? It's not about saying yes or no on the disbursement. It's about directing it. Karen, and then we'll go back to Kim.
So we don't have a choice of where it's going.
You do.
Going right to the property.
Your choice is two. John, for the cruise, or property. Yes means John, no means property, but you can't elect a third option that says, no, I think a better use would be go paint lines on the parking lot. No, that's not an option.
So it has, okay, so it has originally all come into the property budget. That's why we're staying under the property.
We set it up that way because we know that the non-property budgeted expense fund is a permanent account that will have forever expenses related to this property that needs to be maintained. And because we can't open up discussion for amendment to these motions because the meeting will go on for days and weeks, it's a yes or no vote on what he proposes. Yes, it'll go to him. No, we defeated that, but now it's going to go over here to the property. Because if we open it up to, well, what about this and what about that, and I want to change the amount, I want to change the percentage, I want it to go someplace else, we'll be in an endless cycle of motions and amendments that will take us nowhere. So it's yes or no. Yes for John or no for the property expense. That's the way all those votes will work. But an option is not door number 3 for some other purpose, or sorry, we're not going to disperse anything. We're going to disperse the $1,000. You're just controlling where it goes. Kim?
So council proposes 5 sub-funds for the congregational meeting, but at the congregational meeting, the congregation votes down 2 of them. That means you can only have 3 sub-funds that are operating until the next year, right? Because you're only proposing them at the congregation.
In the way you're asking that question, if you can't hear, her question was if we have 5 sub-funds proposed and only 3 are accepted, we're only going to have 3 going into the coming year. The answer to that broadly is yes. There's some mechanics around that we won't need to get into now. But we only have as many existing sub-funds as the congregation approves, whether that's 1 or 5 or somewhere in between. We'll always have at least 1 because non-budgeted property expense is permanent. It never is going to go away. It's a permanent fund. But the other 4 are up for grabs in any given year, is what it'll amount to. Any other questions about that? Yeah, John.
Is there a limit on the percentage of money that goes into the non-budgeted property expense sub-fund?
No. That could be a dollar figure or it could be a percentage by the rules of the policy. So it could be anything from $0 to the maximum amount we're dispersing for the year, or it could be on a percentage basis anywhere from 0 to 100%. It can't exceed 100% because there's only so many dollars we're going to disperse in any particular year. And I'm sorry I didn't repeat his question, but he was asking if there was a cap on the amount of money that could go into the non-budgeted property sub-fund account in any given year, and the answer to that is no. It can be the maximum amount that's being dispersed. Any other questions? But I want to emphasize this point that the congregation is not voting on whether or not we'll allocate or distribute any money. You're just saying yes or no, where's it going to go? So we will distribute money. It's just a matter of telling us where it will go. Next, please. So how do we calculate what is going to be dispersed? So the cash value of endowment fund investments on December 31st of the current year will be the starting point for calculating the annual disbursement to be made to sub-funds no later than February 15th of the following year. 5% of the December 31 value will be distributed. In addition, 20% of any new money received during the calendar year just ended will be added to the 5% in the first bullet point. The dollar values of both the 5% and the additional 20% disbursements will be rounded up to the nearest $100 to provide a round dollar amount for total disbursement. Next. So this is how it works. Let's use an example. So starting at the top, December 31st cash value of the endowment fund, we're just making it up for illustration, it's $99,500. If we calculate 5% of that, that comes to $4,975. If we round that number to the nearest $100, that takes us to $5,000. So that would be the 5% distribution is $5,000. However, we also have the new money piece. So if new money received in the endowment fund during that year that just ended was $3,750, 27% of that is $744. $744 typo, rounded up to the nearest $100 would be $800. So now what we have is $5,000 for the December 31st 5% distribution, $800 for the 20% new money distribution means we're going to distribute a grand total of $5,800. Right? No pennies, no odd dollar amounts. We get rid of all that with the rounding, and we're looking at $5,800 that can go however it is that the council comes to you with a motion, and you can direct as you want to by voting yes or no for each one of those motions. And those motions will be one at a time. You don't get them as a package. If there's 5 different sub-funds, we're going to have 5 different votes, yes or no on each one, not bundled all together as a single vote. Yes, Janet?
Is new money received in the endowment fund, is that where the $500,000 will be coming?
I'm sorry?
The $500,000,
yes.
That will be under the new money received?
Yes, so Janet's question is, if this bequest that we think we're about to receive in fact is $500,000, is that going to be considered new money in the endowment fund? And the answer is yes, because it would be received during this calendar year between January 1st and December 31st. And that is a tremendous thing to have to understand, because we're going to see in the very next slide how that's going to make this a big deal. I'm sorry, you had another point?
And that would be 20% of that?
That is correct, which you'll see on the very next slide, but it's a great point and why we're wanting to talk about this in some format today. So, you know, she's calling out, yes, if that's true, which it is, then we're thinking about 20% of that coming into play in the next calendar year. Next slide, please. So now if we take the last slide and apply next year logic to it, let's walk through what next year might look like. December 31st cash value of the endowment fund might look like $735,000. So recently, not to the day because the market value moves each day up or down, but recently we had about $235,000 in that account. And if we add $500,000 to it by way of the bequest, we might be closer to $735,000. If we take 5% of that for the 5% rule, we would see $36,750, which would be theoretically available for disbursement. However, as Janet just called out, we're anticipating at least $500,000 being received just in that one gift. That doesn't even include what we might get from any of you or other members of Prince of Peace that may come in during the calendar year. But just for simple math, I kept it at $500,000, like that's all we're going to see for the year. And if we distribute 20% of that, as Janet just pointed out, that would be another $100,000. Well, suddenly, with the rounding and so forth that takes place, our 5% allocation would be $36,800. Our 20% new money allocation would be another $100,000, and suddenly we're looking at around $136,800 that we would be distributing in the next calendar year. That's a big number, an unprecedented number. Okay? So that's why some thought needs to be put into, well, what might we do in terms of directing this money and how might we best use it? Just because it's directed doesn't mean it's going to be immediately spent, because it could be held in these sub-funds indefinitely, right? Or it could be spent very quickly. And what might it be spent on? That's why some thought needs to be put into this, because the last 2 years combined, we've distributed between $25,000 and $30,000 total. Now you're talking about distributing 4 to 5 times that in 1 year. And if we think about this going forward, it's likely that future annual distributions, even if we never have another cent contributed to the endowment fund, might range in the $30,000 or $35,000 a year range, just following the 5% rule, and assuming that there's not a complete collapse of investments in the marketplace. So our mindset needs to become a little different as we go forward about what these disbursements might look like, what we might want to direct the funds to, how intelligently and thoughtfully can we think about the creation of sub-funds. You know, all of that suddenly becomes a much bigger deal. The notion that we would just put a sub-fund out there with $300 in it to help offset assembly expenses probably isn't the way we got to go in the future, because there's going to be tens of thousands of dollars that we got to allocate someplace. So just putting $300 in it to say we're covering the assembly probably isn't the best thought as we go forward. But that would be for the group and the council to like mull over a little bit, right? Not for me to stand here and tell you. But hopefully this gets across the magnitude of what it is that we might be looking at as the calendar flips over to 2025. Next, please. So it might be helpful for us to think about what the normal timeline of activity is around the endowment fund, all right? Typically what happens is the trustees that oversee the endowment fund would make the annual disbursements and get all the sub-funds set based on your November annual meeting decisions, and have all that in place by February 15th the prior year, or excuse me, the following year. We really can't do that until at least January, because all the financial statements for the year end don't come out until some point in January, till we get a meeting organized, till we get all the maneuvers in place. It's normally done in January, but the guidance allows for up to February 15th. Congregation members and council will then conceptualize possible new sub-funds from March through September. That's like an ongoing thought process. Things happen all the time, things change, ideas pop up, so it isn't like one meeting and it's done. That can be part of a long process from our members and council across the March through September period. Council will take these proposals by October and vet them and determine, you know, what specific individual motions can be prepared for the congregational meeting in November. So council's, you know, got to have that together hopefully by October, so that when that November meeting happens, we're ready. At the congregational meeting, members will consider and vote on each motion for disbursement of monies to sub-funds for that, typo again, next year, right? And finally, the bottom point again is the one we were just harping on a little bit ago. Approved motions will be actioned as moved. Defeated motions will result in proposed disbursement amount being directed to the non-budgeted property expense sub-fund. So yes, you're endorsing what council puts forth. No, you're directing it to go to the property situation. Next, please. Endowment trustees will execute the approved disbursements no later than February 15th of the next year, and we start the whole cycle over again. Right? That kind of takes this full calendar year all the way around. There's 3 endowment trustees who oversee the function of the endowment fund and report directly to council. Your current trustees are myself, Georgia Sarnowski, and Janet Pearson. Next. So what are the next steps? Due to the exceptionally large annual disbursement which is anticipated based on the generous bequest we expect to be receiving, Council will look to modify the normal timeline of activities which we follow to ensure adequate consideration of how best to handle the disbursement monies, allow for discussion of possible proposals, and to provide open communication to all members. Council's scheduled another informational meeting after worship on July 28th and expects to present a recommendation on the 2025 disbursement. No action will be taken at that time. This will only be an informational meeting. So again, the goal is to get dialogue, get ideas, get people thinking about this, not just walk in cold in November and have a shock about, wow, we hit a $135,000 jackpot. What are we going to do about that? And have to think that through in that moment in time. The idea is to take this time leading up to November and get a game plan in place so that we're making good choices with a sizable amount of money that'll be in play come November. My understanding again is this July 28th meeting, there's no decisions being made. It's council presenting thoughts that they have are beginning to formulate around what this might look like as we go forward. Next. Questions? Anything else from the group?
Very good presentation.
Thank you. If you don't deal with this all the time, and it only comes up once a year at the November meeting, there's a lot riding on decisions that are made, and people are not maybe prepared to think that through. So that's why they've asked for this, and we'll continue to be talking about this leading up to November. But it's crucial as these votes come up that you understand what it is that you're voting on and what action will be taken based on a yes or a no vote. Because it's very easy to think it's one thing when in reality it's something different. And that's why I want to emphasize this point of how that motion business should work. You're not making motions, you're just voting on the motion that council brings to you, and what the outcome of that will be is important to know before you vote. Yes?
The information that I could read on the screen was very clearly written, presented. I think it's a good idea if you're not ready to send it out to the congregation.
So the point that Karen is making is she felt like what we had here on the screen was clear and understandable, and that it may be worthwhile to forward a version of this, maybe formatted a little differently to the congregation in one means or another. So if others feel the same way, we may want to encourage council to consider that. Looking around quickly, I see at least Tina, I believe, is currently on council, and might want to take that back as a thought for council. I can share with the materials I have with a quick little cleanup of a typo here or there that might be appropriate if they want anything to forward out to the group. Seems to me like a mailing may be appropriate given the size of the money that's at stake at this particular situation in November. Anything else? Thoughts, comments, questions? Yes?
When will that request be realized?
I think the pastor's best estimate of that based on, let me start again. Carolyn's asking, do we have an idea of when we'll actually be receiving this money? And I believe the pastor's best estimate of that, as he's been the contact person from the legal representation that's handling the estate, was that sometime after September 1, we'll say, in the fall months, was likely where it is that they expected this to be resolved. I think there was some degree of confidence that it would fall in 2024 because there's been knowledge that this was coming for some time, but it wasn't shared with the masses until there was some degree of certainty that it would fall within the calendar year. Otherwise, you got a lot of people all whipped up into a frenzy and nothing happening because of delays on the legal settlement side. So I think his understanding is it may not be tomorrow, may not be next week. It's probably sometime from September 1 forward, but prior to December 31st. I would hope that based on what we've said, it is realized before the November meeting so that we got facts in front of us. Even in the November meeting, these estimates on what the disbursement will be for 2025 will still vary minimally, because if you recall, it's dependent on December 31st values. So even though we put the money into an investment, let's say in October or November, it could go up, down, sideways, whichever way between then and the end of the year, and that'll cause these totals to move marginally up or down. So the totals that you see there now are purely an estimate, and as I mentioned, they do not reflect any attempts to guesstimate what other monies we've already received independent of the bequest or that we might yet receive before the end of the calendar year. Other questions? Then I thank you for attending. I appreciate your time. I know everybody's got other stuff to do. At least it was cool in here. We beat the heat for another hour or whatever, right? So stay cool, and we'll hopefully see you next time on the 28th. Thank you.